The first question in Rome after Cannae was not how many men had died. The city could not yet know that with any precision. The first question was where Hannibal was. News traveled faster than armies, but it did not arrive in order. Rumor came in pieces. The army destroyed, Paulus dead, Varro escaped or perhaps not escaped, the camps fallen, the enemy still in Apulia, and no one could yet say whether the next dust cloud on the southern road would prove a courier, a fugitive, or Carthaginian cavalry. The Senate's first answer was discipline. Public mourning was restricted, guards stood at the gates, scouts went south along the roads, and families waited for lists that could only come slowly, name by name, household by household. Cannae had happened hundreds of kilometers away, but the meaning of the defeat entered Rome through doors and shrines, through streets, and through the empty places at family tables. Livy gives the city its fear and its sound after the news came in. He has Fabius call for riders along the Appian and Latin roads, for reports brought to the praetors, for families to wait within their houses, and for the gates to become the line between order and flight. Rome was not simply grieving. Rome was laboring to govern what grief could do to a state. The city had reasons to imagine the worst. Hannibal had outrun Roman expectations since the first news of the Alpine crossing. He had appeared where Roman planning had not looked for him. He had beaten armies in the north, destroyed a column at Trasimene, slipped out of Fabius' net, and now he had broken the greatest force ever sent against him. The phrase Hannibal at the gates belongs to later memory, but the fear beneath it had been earned. And the fear reached beyond the walls. If Rome looked finished, every allied town had to ask whether loyalty remained prudent. A city did not need to admire an invader before opening negotiations with him. It needed only to believe that the old protector could protect no longer. The Senate's discipline inside Rome was therefore itself a message to Italy before ever envoys and letters carried the message outward. Hannibal had destroyed the army Rome had raised to destroy him, and in the world around Rome, a defeat of that scale could open the road to embassies, prisoners, terms, and the careful saving of what could be saved. Carthage had accepted such a settlement after the First Punic War. Greek cities and Hellenistic kingdoms made peace after decisive defeat as a matter of course, preserving what could be preserved. Rome did not move towards surrender after Cannae. It asked whether Hannibal was marching, and while it waited for the answer, it began to turn defeat into procedure. The surviving consul, Varro, returned from Venusia with the broken edge of the army. Later tradition heaped the blame for the battle upon him, and the blame was politically useful, yet the Senate did not prosecute him. It received him formally and thanked him because he had not despaired of the Republic. The first Italian communities to matter after Cannae were not defectors. They were Canusium and Venusia, taking in fugitives, billeting them, finding clothes and money and weapons where they could. The tradition preserves Bucer of Canusium, a wealthy Apulian woman who fed and helped the survivors until the Senate honored her for it in later days. Before Capua opened its gates to Hannibal, other towns had opened their doors to the wreckage of a Roman army. That gesture was more than courtesy. The Senate had lost kinsmen and colleagues, sons and clients at Cannae, and it could have offered the city a culprit. Instead, it kept the surviving magistrate inside the state, for Rome needed commands and levies, oaths, roads, treasury orders, and discipline more urgently than it needed a public sacrifice of blame. The harder test came with the prisoners. Hannibal held thousands of Roman and allied captives after the battle, and in the ordinary practice of the age, ransom was plausible. Families would pay, the state could negotiate, captives could come home under terms every power in the Mediterranean understood. Hannibal had reason to expect that a ransom embassy might open the way toward wider negotiation. The Senate answered by refusing the premise of the request. The prices preserved in the tradition are ordinary enough to sharpen the refusal. Horsemen and foot soldiers and enslaved attendants sorted into sums of money, and the prisoners arguing that buying them back would cost less than buying new slave volunteers for the army. Rome refused the public ransom and forbade private families to raise the money themselves. The hard edge of the decision lives in that second clause. Without it, wealthy houses could have bought back their sons and brothers, fathers and clients. With it, the refusal became policy rather than poverty. Rome would not teach its soldiers that surrender purchased return, and Rome would not let Hannibal turn prisoners into silver, influence, and an open diplomatic channel. Hannibal sent Carthalo besides to speak for him, and Roman tradition has the envoy turned away before he could enter the city. The gesture was blunt. Rome would hear from its own captives, whose words belonged inside Roman discipline. It would not receive a Carthaginian spokesman carrying the implied beginning of terms. The difference matters. The captives asked for their lives. Carthalo represented victory. The refusal protected, too, the public rule the Republic needed if it meant to keep fighting. A Roman army could be destroyed, Roman soldiers could die, families could mourn behind closed doors. What the state could not do was publicly accept that surrender on the field had created a claim upon Roman money. The captive's suffering became part of a message addressed to every future legionary. Survival after surrender laid no obligation upon the Republic to restore you. The decision was severe, but its severity was not only of the heart. It announced that Cannae had not changed the category of the war. Rome had lost a battle. It had not entered a negotiation from defeat. At the same time, Rome widened the meaning of military service. The emergency levy reached past every normal habit. The dictator called up men from 17 years old, and some younger still. Debt and criminal status could be suspended or redirected. Men below the usual property line could be used. Enslaved men were purchased by the state, asked one by one whether they were willing to serve, armed, and promised freedom through service. The tradition names them the volones, the volunteers, though the word carries all the strain of a society asking the unfree to defend the city that owned them. The decision touched the Roman idea of the army itself. Normal service presumed property and census rating, equipment, and a citizen body that could arm itself or be armed by the state. The emergency after Cannae reached underneath that whole frame. It did not abolish Roman hierarchy. It showed how far the Republic would bend hierarchy when the life of the state was at stake. Marcus Junius Pyrrha was named dictator for the levy, and that office produced no heroic battlefield painting. It produces a better one: lamps in the curia, tablets and names, treasury orders and messengers, armor brought out of storehouses and temples, young men being counted, enslaved volunteers receiving weapons, magistrates working through the night, while the city still does not know whether Hannibal will appear. Rome's religious answer belonged to the same crisis machinery. The Sibylline books were consulted, a mission went to Delphi in some accounts, and the record preserves rituals that the tradition itself marks as foreign to Roman practice, among them the burial alive of Greek and Gallic victims in the Forum Boreum. The treatment belongs at a distance, for the important fact is not spectacle. The important fact is that the state understood defeat as military, civic, and religious disorder together, and tried to answer all three at once. The response was harsh because the shock was real. Rome was not calm, Rome was disciplined under panic. The famous story says that Maharbal urged Hannibal to march at once on Rome. He would ride ahead with the cavalry, and within 5 days Hannibal would feast on the Capitol. And when Hannibal hesitated, Maharbal spoke the line that has followed him for 2,000 years. Hannibal knew how to win a victory, but not how to use one. The scene is Livy's, not Polybius, and it works almost too neatly. It hands history a sentence that sounds like judgment. It invites later readers to imagine the whole war turning on one failure of nerve. It makes the road to Rome look open, because the map between Cannae and the city can be drawn as a single line. The reality after Cannae was less theatrical than the rebuke. Hannibal had won a devastating battle, but his army had fought hard and lost men it could not easily replace, and he had no siege train. Nor was the immediate defense of Rome an empty thing. City legions, Marcellus men at Ostia, a marine legion, the emergency levies, and armed townsmen could together turn a sudden arrival into something very different from a battlefield pursuit. Rome was not a field camp waiting to be stormed. Its walls and its urban multitude, its reserves and the loyal communities near at hand made it a different order of problem. And even at the gates, Hannibal would still have had to feed men and horses while forcing a political result. There is a difference between frightening Rome and taking Rome. Hannibal could do the first. The second required time and equipment, manpower and secure supply, and a political collapse inside the Roman system. A hard ride after Cannae might have deepened the panic, but panic alone opens no gates. Hannibal's victories had been built on movement. A siege would have asked him to stand still in hostile country, with a tired army, and no promise that the towns around Rome would follow Capua's later example. The stronger point is strategic. Hannibal had not crossed the Alps because he expected to batter down Rome's walls. He had come to make Rome's Italian system defect. His release of non-Roman prisoners after his victories had never been mercy in the abstract, it was policy. He wanted the allies to see a future outside Roman command. Cannae gave him the best demonstration he would ever have. Rome had gathered its greatest army and lost it. Roman and allied dead across 3 years had become enormous. The Senate had refused ransom and refused negotiation, and that refusal would matter only so long as the allies believed Rome could still protect them. Capua, therefore, mattered more than any marchline on a map. Capua was no village wavering in fear. It was the leading city of Campania, and after Rome, among the richest and proudest communities in Italy, with a history beside Rome that was old, useful, and uneasy. It had its own elite, its own dignity, and its own idea of what the order of Italy might become if Rome no longer ruled it. One doubtful tradition even claimed that Capua had demanded a Campanian consul as the price of loyalty, a story Livy himself did not trust, and yet the rumor catches the mood. Capua was imagining rank, not merely rescue. After Cannae, the Capuan magistrates treated with Hannibal, and the terms the tradition preserves are revealing. No Carthaginian official would hold authority over Campanian citizens. No Capuan would serve against his will. Capua would keep its own laws and its own magistrates. This was not surrender to a new master in any simple form. It was a bid for restored autonomy inside a settlement led by Carthage. For Hannibal, Capua was proof that the theory could work. Victory on the field could produce political movement. The city opened its gates, and other Campanian towns followed in smaller numbers. Some Apulian towns came over, much of Samnium, parts of Lucania and Bruttium, and later Locri and Tarentum moved into the Carthaginian orbit. Carthage itself heard the report of victory and saw the rings of the Roman equestrians poured out as proof that the blow had landed. For Capua, the decision had a local logic of its own. The city was not only asking who would win the war, it was asking what Italy would look like afterward. Under Rome it held status, wealth, and protection, but never supremacy. Under a victorious Hannibal, Capua could imagine itself the first city of a southern Italian order, with a far-off Carthaginian patron who might demand loyalty and supplies, while leaving the local great houses more room than Rome had ever left them. So the map after Cannae truly changed, and it would be false to say that Italy held without bending. It bent. Carthaginian influence spread across the south, and Hannibal now had cities and stores, winter quarters, political envoys, and the prestige of a commander who had beaten Rome 3 times on Italian ground. But a map can lie by coloring only the places that moved. The places that did not move matter more. Most Campanian communities did not follow Capua. The Latin colonies did not defect. Central Italy held. The roads and the colonial foundations, the allied obligations and the annual habit of the levy did not dissolve because one army had died. The Latin colonies are the load-bearing wall of the post-Cannae story. They were no ordinary subject towns waiting for a better patron, but Roman-founded communities planted at the strategic points of Italy, with their own laws and magistrates and deep structural ties to Rome. They supplied men, they guarded roads, they anchored whole regions, they made Roman power present without a Roman garrison standing in every place. Manpower figures show the scale of it. In 218 BC, the 30 Latin colonies could supply tens of thousands of foot and horse, the wider Italian allies far more. The Confederation's whole military reserve was measured in the hundreds of thousands. Not all of that could be armed and moved and fed and commanded at once, but the number explains why Cannae did not end the war of itself. Hannibal had destroyed a field army. He had not destroyed the rolls from which armies were drawn. The rolls are not an exciting image until they become the image that decides the war. A battlefield shows who stood in one place on one day. A levy roll shows whether another army can exist next spring. Rome's advantage after Cannae was not that it could ignore its losses. It could not. The advantage was that the losses could be converted into a new round of demands, and that enough communities still recognized those demands as binding. Nor was the Allied system a painless loyalty. Some communities were exhausted, and later in the war, a group of Latin colonies declared that they could no longer meet Rome's demands for men. The tradition makes the Senate quail at the implication: if these colonies stopped, others might follow, and the Allies might conclude that the Roman dominion was finished. The point matters because inability is not defection. The envoys did not open their gates to Hannibal, they reported strain. Rome remembered the refusal, punished it in coin when it could, and kept the relationship alive. The record is administrative rather than romantic, and that is exactly why it matters. The same distinction runs across Italy. Fear and resentment, exhaustion and calculation did not all point one way. A community might hate the Roman levies and still prefer a Roman victory, might admire Hannibal and still doubt that Carthage could protect it, might wait upon its neighbors, might be divided within itself, one faction of its elite looking to Hannibal and another to Rome. The confederation held, in part, because it was never one simple emotion capable of reversing everywhere at once. Hannibal's new allies changed his own problem besides. Before Cannae, he could move as raider and destroyer, punishing territory, choosing his roads, refusing the battles he did not want. After Capua, he had obligations. Allies expected protection, cities expected garrisons and relief, grain and respect for their autonomy, and the southern communities had small reason to fight far from their own lands for any Carthaginian grand design. They wanted Hannibal near enough to keep Roman armies away. The reversal is simple to state. After Cannae, Hannibal had strongholds to act from and allies to protect. Those were not the same thing. Rome understood the change and returned to a version of the Fabian War. It declined another single enormous field battle against Hannibal. It raised new forces, shadowed and harassed and besieged, punished defectors where it could, and made Hannibal answer local crises. The following season shows the new shape in movement rather than theory. Cals covering the road from Capua toward Rome, Susula watching Nola, Gracchus covering the coastal cities, and Hannibal compelled to answer to allies as well as enemies. The war ceased to be a procession of grand Roman armies walking onto Hannibal's chosen fields. It became a contest of towns and ports, roads, loyalties, and supply. That change altered the visual scale of the war. The decisive images are no longer battle lines only. They are gates and storehouses, roads and harbors, envoys and towns, deciding which side can still make its promises believed. A garrison in a citadel may matter more than a cavalry charge. A ship reaching Locri with money and elephants may matter more than a heroic speech. A Latin colony sending fewer men than before, but still sending them, may matter more than a town whose defection makes a brighter color on the map. Capua reveals the new shape of the war entire. Hannibal needed it as proof that Italy could leave Rome. Rome needed to recover it as proof that leaving carried a cost. For years, Capua drew armies and grain, prestige and fear toward itself. The Roman recovery of the city lies beyond this chapter, but its meaning begins here. The city that had imagined a greater place for itself in Campania became the target whose punishment would be read across all Italy. That later ending belongs beyond the immediate shock, but it grows from this soil. Capua's defection gave Hannibal his greatest political prize and gave Rome a target whose recovery could reverse the lesson of Cannae. Cannae did not fail as a battlefield victory. It did everything a battlefield victory could do. It killed the army, shook the city, opened Capua, drew the southern communities toward Hannibal, and forced Rome into emergency measures that laid bare the strain inside its own society. The failure lay in the distance between a battlefield and a confederation. Rome's power was not one army, it was the habit of making more armies. It was a Senate that could refuse ransom while arming enslaved volunteers, a network of colonies that could be exhausted without defecting, allies who might resent Rome and still fear Hannibal too little, trust Carthage too little, or simply need neither enough to move. After Cannae, the war grew larger rather than shorter. Sicily would shift, Syracuse would be drawn in, Philip of Macedon would make his treaty with Hannibal, Spain would become the Second War, the war against the Barcid system itself. Capua and Tarentum, Locri, Sardinia, and the sea lanes would all come to matter because the field at Cannae had not produced a surrender. Hannibal had won the afternoon. Rome kept the machinery of the war turning, and the next struggle would decide whether that machinery could still reach beyond Italy.